one of the things I was really interested in coming to Germany was to compare it to Canada. Because when it comes to countries that are consumed by guilt, self-hatred, attempting to bury the past, trying to force globalization and mass immigration, diversity, and all that stuff on their citizens, Germany is often the example people give because of the Holocaust. So I was curious to see, given just the reputation it has, how it compares to just my experience living on a daily basis in Canada. And I'm going to have to say, as prevalent as it is here, at least where I live in Canada, it's not even close. The Holocaust gets mentioned a lot, but I find it gets mentioned nowhere near as much as Indigenous issues get mentioned in Canada. I haven't been to a Catholic church here yet, so I don't know if they do the equivalent of land acknowledgements before them. Because in a lot of churches in Canada, before Mass, the priest will acknowledge that we're on Indigenous territory. One concert I went to at a seminary, they said we all live on Turtle Island and stuff like that. I think one of them talked about the Great Creator or something like that. So, like, for instance, I haven't seen any license plates yet. I maybe haven't been looking closely enough that like talk about the Holocaust or talk about how evil Germany is. Whereas like where I live, a substantial percentage of the license plates have a red dress on them, which is a symbol of the missing Indigenous women. I also just don't see like Yiddish or Jewish flags like everywhere. Like when you enter a lot of public buildings in Canada, there'll be something written in some Indigenous language or Inuit or something like that. There'll be a land acknowledgement, or there'll be like this place was built on land that was stolen, or something like that. So it doesn't seem really even comparable. Like there's a lot of guilt, there's a lot of stuff about like Nazism and stuff like that. I don't find it though nearly as aggressive. That might just be because it's further in the past and a lot of the damage has kind of already been done, but it's not nearly as active, I find. Now I say that next to this museum here where they have a big thing about racism, anti-Semitism, nationalism, and hate, which I get that's bad, but it's like compared to Canada once again. Like, for instance, the fact that you have a Protestant cathedral that doesn't have a rainbow flag on it is kind of baffling to me. The fact that there are Protestant churches in this city at all that don't have rainbow flags on them is baffling to me, because just about every single United or Anglican church in Canada will have multiple rainbow flags, generally speaking. A lot of them won't have Canadian flags. They'll also just have flyers and posters, and if there's a bulletin board, a full half of it will just be LGBTQ stuff. So that is kind of surreal for me. I didn't see anything in there about like the role that the church took in killing in like the Holocaust. If anything, I've actually seen a couple things that said that a lot of Christians were against the Nazi party, or things like that. That to me is like, that wouldn't happen in Canada. In Canada, it's just open, basically, at least in my experience, incitement to hatred against all religious institutions because of the residential school thing. So I just don't find it like nearly as prevalent. Like I said, I don't see Holocaust acknowledgement statements in like a large number of public buildings, but the gender stuff is really much less prevalent here. The fact that like I haven't seen that many rainbow flags. I've seen a couple. I've seen one or two buildings that have LGBTQ friendly or whatever, but in Toronto it's probably about, to be conservative, about 40% of businesses have rainbow flags. I also haven't seen any rainbow crosswalks or big or flags on like government buildings, which once again is just kind of surreal to me, because that's just extremely common in Canada. It's kind of weird to just not see that everywhere. Another thing is seeing BC and AD is kind of a bit surreal, especially in relatively modern museums or exhibits that have just opened. I can't really recall many things made in Canada in the last 20 years that weren't explicitly by like right-wing people that say AD or BC. It's almost entirely BCE and CE at the moment. And I think like you get in trouble if you put those on university papers or something like that. So to even see, like I was in the couple of history museums and they had BC down, and it was just kind of like a weird experience for me. I don't know, like I hadn't seen, like I was in a couple of museums and there wasn't a specific exhibit on trannies, on stuff like that. I think it got mentioned once that the Nazis burned medical research on diseases that affected homosexuals, and that was pretty much it. Like, even the fact, and I get that they're like a paused globalist fake conservative party, the fact that you guys even have a party that has Christian in its name is surreal to me. Coming from Canada, that would never be allowed to happen there. We have like one party that has it in its name called the Christian Heritage Party, and it's widely despised. It's basically, we don't really shut down parties in Canada. We just deny them all access to stuff. The fact that any figure like in Germany prior to the 1960s is portrayed like positively is also kind of weird. The fact that you still have statues of like Frederick the Great and like positive things said about various kings of Prussia is just really weird. Because in Canada we're in the process of removing basically everything that happened before like the 1960s or 1980s. Like the founder of our country, John A. Macdonald, has been canceled. They're renaming one of the biggest universities in Canada. They're renaming the biggest public square in Canada. They're pulling down statues all over the place. Maybe that's happening in Germany, but the fact that I even see any is just kind of weird to me. The fact that you have buildings that don't have rainbow flags on them, and maybe I'm exaggerating, but not by that much. Not by that much. I invite you to go to Toronto or Winnipeg or Ottawa or another, even in the suburbs part of Canada, even in like based 90% like safe conservative ridings. Furthermore, and I know a lot of people here don't like the AfD and think they're too moderate, the fact that you have an anti-immigration party that wins elections, at least gets a plurality of the vote or a plurality of seats, if not comes first, is also kind of surreal to me. The only party in Canada that's anti-immigration at a federal level is the People's Party of Canada, which I've had people say is like, by European standards, some people have called Bernier like center left. But like, they get like 1 or 2% of the vote, and they're widely despised, and they're seen as a neo-Nazi party. And I get that like the AfD is portrayed that way too, but the fact that they get any votes at all is weird. I think like the SPD is doing this like border security push at the moment or something like that. But no, like I haven't seen nearly as much anti-racism stuff. I haven't seen nearly as much like diversity. Like in Canada, when I walk down the street, probably about 20% of the businesses I see relate to immigration in some way. Or at least when it comes to ads. There's just English as a second language, there's immigration law, there's job finding, there's how to apply for benefits and stuff like that. I haven't really seen that much here. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, just for my couple days here, and I know it's a small sample, but I've been to probably a dozen museums, a couple churches, and a whole bunch of other just kind of major public squares. Canada's way more paused, way more self-hating, and stuff like that, than Germany is. But that might just be my experience, and I find, like, this with dealing with a lot of people, like people from Poland will say, like, Poland's as bad as Canada, and they'd say that even before the last election, when Law and Justice was in power, and they'd be like, oh, well, Law and Justice is as bad as Justo, or like, Poland's not based, Poland's like as shit libby as Canada is. And I'm just like, you don't know what you're talking about. Like, you just, I get that your countries have problems, but it's also kind of like, and I get really tired of dealing with Catholics from red states, because they don't really get it. They're like, oh, why don't you just go to the conservative church? I'm like, that's not how it works in this country, in Canada. Why don't you just go to the Latin Mass? Well, there isn't one in a lot of cases. It's like, well, what do you mean your priest is saying you have to accept trans people, and that Christians are as bad as ISIS, and you have to, it's your duty to accept unlimited immigration from the third world? Just go to a different church. And like, but that's just the way it is. I've been to a couple conservative Catholic churches in Canada, but they're very much the exception, not the rule. I've heard that the German church is bad. I don't know if the German church is as bad as the Canadian one, or how they rank up to each other. Generally speaking, I've heard that the German, Canadian, and Low Countries are like the three worst in the world, but I'm not entirely sure. I think in America it's very divided, like everything in America is divided. So those are my thoughts on the matter. God bless, and I'll talk to you again real soon.